Welcome to Commander Central, episode 278, and today we'll be talking about Voltron decks in Commander. I'm Dana.
I'm Max.
And I'm Chris.
Max and Chris, how are you guys doing today?
Good.
I don't know.
Weekend's coming up. Everyone's kind of getting ready to ease into that. For us, at least. This show airs on a Monday, but we're recording on a Friday.
Sure am.
And we're talking Voltron, so dibs on the Red Lion. That's who I get to be.
Nice. Did you watch that cartoon when you were a kid? Or is that before your time, kind of?
I think it was on syndication, like on Toonami for a while when I was a kid, or even on some weird channel that we probably only got through satellite TV. But I've seen some of the remakes. I know the Netflix show is pretty good, so...
Yeah, I watched that with my kid a couple years back when it first came out. And when I was young, the original, old anime-ish one, because I lived out in the country when I was a kid, too, so we only had, whatever channels we could get across, the airwaves television with an antenna. So, after school, it was on for a brief window, when I was in third grade or something. I caught it for, 6 months before it switched to, with G.I. Joe or He-Man or something. So I did watch it as a kid for a little bit, at least. And they had both the Lion Voltron and the vehicle, the 15 vehicle Voltron was a show too. And it switched, at some point it switched between the two.
I've never heard of the vehicle one.
And so, yeah, and there also was, so the Lion Voltron was Voltron 3, and the vehicle Voltron was Voltron 1, and there was a second one that was 5 robots, I think, that turned into a Voltron, but that never had a cartoon, I don't think.
Voltron Vehicle Force, aka Voltron 1. Huh.
Yeah, and I think that, the 15 vehicles could each... 5 of them could assemble into a larger machine as well, so that it was a multiple transformer. You could make 3 vehicles out of the 15 and then combine them all into a robot. So not the conversation anyone was ready for on this Commander program talking about Voltron, but here we are. Any fun games for anybody this week? Anybody play anything? Chris has been modern testing again. I know that. How's that going, Chris?
It's okay, I guess. I'm still not settled on a deck, and I have a tournament in a week now. Yeah, so the 7th of August. So yeah, it's coming up quick. I still haven't settled on a deck yet.
Do you have it down to a couple of finalists here, or are you just still totally in the weeds?
Yeah, it's going to be some sort of 4 or 5 color deck of some sort. I'm not sure if I'm going to go elementals or if I'm going to go a domain deck. I haven't decided yet.
Okay. How about you, Max? You been playing anything at all?
I got to play on the EDH Recast stream this week.
That's right, you did.
So that was fun. I played Dramoka. I kind of was a politic maker because I bet a bunch of channel points on Twitch to make sure Joey wouldn't die first. And so I was essentially insider trading. And I made sure Joey did not die first. I killed Angelo, a.k.a. the Jusk guy, first. And then Joey took the game away because he was playing his mono blue partner deck.
That's why we killed Joey first.
Yeah.
Yeah, you filled in for me because I got called into work at the last minute. So Max subbed for me and got to play some games. So that was kind of cool. So thank you for that, Max.
No problem. It was a bunch of fun hanging out with your other show.
Yes, indeed. I played at the shop this week on Tuesday. The one notable game, I did post this little thing on Twitter, but I will mention it here briefly, is I tried out Masterful Replication in my equipment deck, which lets you turn an artifact into a copy of another artifact you control to end a turn. And I had good luck. I'm running Echo Storm in that deck, which lets you make a copy of an artifact. And my commanders are cheap, so I've been able to copy to make an artifact copy of something 2 or 3 or 4 times, which is pretty efficient. So I'm I'll try Masterful Replication and see what happens. And when I top decked it, I think I had 18 artifacts in play between mana rocks and a couple of artifact lands and different equipment and a handful of treasure tokens as well. And so I was able to make all of them into copies of Sword of Fire and Ice. And usually that's obviously not an ideal move, but I have Arden in the deck, so I can equip for free. So I was able to equip those swords for free and swing in. And I had Helvar out, which gives an equipped creature a double strike. So it was, a gazillion damage to somebody. Then Fire and Ice has that 2 damage trigger for each hit, 18 times 2 on that 2 damage trigger. And then I drew 36 cards too on top of it all. So that felt pretty good.
Sounds like you were cheating. That's what that sounds like.
Very much sounds like that, yes.
Right out of my mouth, Chris.
Yeah. And then as I'm doing it, I'm like, how come no one runs this in their equipment decks? I'm like, because everyone's equipment decks are Boros, so that's not an option in no one else is, for the most part, people aren't really playing blue in their equipment decks. So if you happen to be, Master Replication is disgusting. It really worked well.
I feel sorry for your opponents, to be honest with you. I would have looked at you, I would have just been like, Dana, I'm not playing with you anymore. You play all these random wacky cards and you make them work, and I don't think it's fair.
I'm trying to think who I killed. I think it was our friend Blake, and I didn't feel terrible about it. He's a buddy of mine. If it would have been a stranger, I might have felt kind of bad, but he's a guy I've known for, 8 or 9 years now, so I didn't feel too terrible about it. And my kid might have him for a teacher at some point, too, so... Anyway, yeah. So if you out there in listener land want to tell us about some fun games you played, how would you go about doing that, Chris?
Well, you can reach us on a multitude of social media platforms. You can find us on Twitter at CMDR Central. You can search us up on Facebook, CMDR Central. You can find us online at cmdrcentral.com, and you can also find us on YouTube by searching CMDR Central.
You can also head over to patreon.com/CMDR Central. Check out our reward tiers, such as a Decks You Play show, or just joining our community to hang out and chat with us.
Yes, indeed. We appreciate the support, both from Patreon supporters and from people who just listen to the show and smash that like and upvote button. We really appreciate it. It goes a long way towards keeping us on the air and letting us show up every week and share these shows and stories with all y'all. One thing that popped up this week I want to get you guys' opinion on real quick is we got a handful of new cards that are going to be available on Arena only, and they're going to have Arena only mechanics. And we've got a preview of a few of those as well. And they tend to be things that really aren't doable in an actual paper game. For example, there's a Davriel Planeswalker deck, and you have to pick an option for one of his abilities, and you can get a thing that's an upside, and then you have to choose a downside as well. I don't have the list in front of me, but it's a long list of a dozen different things you choose from, and that's just not feasible to do on a card. There's just too many different choices. So that's one example. One thing is a creature's permanently have a thing that changes, and it's not marked with counters. It's just a permanent change that you have to remember. Easy to do digitally, not something they can do on cards. Do either of you two have thoughts? We're not big Arena players, any of us, but we've all played it a little bit. Do you guys care about that? Do you think it's a bad thing, a good thing? Are you ambivalent? Do either of you have thoughts on it at all?
I definitely think you can tell this was designed for a video game, essentially. This is specifically made for Arena. I mean, I don't even think this is coming to MTGO, is it?
I don't believe so, no.
Yeah, so I get it in the aspect of it's a way to get Jumpstart cards, our new Jumpstart cards out for Arena only, because it's easy for the computer to always put that extra +2/+2 on that card digitally versus us remembering it. I do think those keywords of Perpetual and Seek, Perpetual specifically, is going to be hard for the people who want to try it in paper. I've seen some stuff on Twitter where people are like, hey, the Sarkhan is one of them. I hope people will let me rule 0 this in my Sarkhan Dragons deck. I think the Perpetual keyword is going to be extremely hard to keep track of in a paper format just because of board states get messy and you can't, that token might move from that card to something else that you had it written on. And I don't know, I'm not a fan of the idea of bringing them into paper, but I haven't done it yet. I haven't played against them yet for the people who want to rule 0 them, so I'll try anything once, I guess.
How about you, Chris? What do you think about those? Or just at least the idea of it overall?
I think the idea overall is fine. All they're trying to do, in my opinion, is just draw more people towards Arena base. Yeah. I know, for a while there, MTGO was having an issue with people being unable to get cards and stuff like that because, Mana Traders and whatever the other one was, where you couldn't actually get more new people in to get the cards. So maybe they're just trying to pull people into Arena then, is where the aspect's going. Personally, I could care less either way. Whichever way it goes, it goes. I'll play, whatever's out there and have fun doing it. So
I didn't love it at first. When they first announced it, I was like, "You're kidding me!" Because it first of all seemed like a cash grab, which I guess everything when you're a business is a cash grab, I guess technically. But I'm like, okay, so now if you are somebody who loves Chandra or something, you're going to have to play Arena to get access to this Chandra card. So my first knee-jerk reaction was I was pretty against it. But once they revealed that the cards all were things that had weird abilities that we're basically arena only for the most part. Yes, people could print that Davriel card out and have a list of those abilities, and I would probably not have a huge problem with that to rule zero that in. But like for the most part, it's stuff that you're just not going to use unless you're playing on arena. That's a little bit different, I guess. I've come around on it as a result of that. It's not like they've just printed a new version of Swords to Plowshares that we don't have access to in paper. It's a new version of something that you can't kind of play in paper for the most part. Then I don't care. Like, whatever. It's kind of a cash grab, but it's also just a different thing at that point, and that's fine. So I've kind of come around on it despite my initial, like, oh, come on, reaction. So we just wanted to quick mention that and talk about it, but we will jump into the main show topic since it doesn't really affect us since we're not huge arena players and the cards aren't going to be in Commander anyway. I saw a post this week, and I unfortunately don't remember who it was from. It might have been from the Commander Sphere podcast, but I'm not positive, asking if Voltron was still viable in Commander. And I saw a bunch of responses from people saying they didn't think it was. And I don't really agree with that, but I wanted to talk about it anyway, just both whether or not it's viable and just talk about it in general, because we haven't really done a show on that. To start out, I will just read the definition of Voltron, because I guess we're assuming everyone knows what it is, but on the off chance you don't, I went to the EDH wiki, and it defines Voltron as a deck archetype dedicated to gathering a large number of power-enhancing cards, usually auras and equipment, onto a single creature, usually a player's commander. If enhanced enough, the creature becomes impossible for opponents to stop, and it deals lethal damage in a small number of attack steps, often winning the game by dealing 21 commander damage to each opponent. So, I guess the first question I'm going to ask, and I'll ask Max first, and then he can pass it to Chris. Do you personally still think Voltron's a viable thing in Commander?
I 100% think Voltron is a viable archetype in Commander. I'm a little biased. I have a Voltron deck. Voltron was one of the first archetypes I built playing Commander. It's an archetype I enjoy playing, so I definitely think it's viable. I think it does have its difficulties, it does have issues with it, but you need to figure out how to get around those, just to make sure you aren't putting all your eggs in one basket.
How about you, Chris? Because now Max has a Voltron deck, but I don't think you currently do, although you've had a Ural to Miststalker deck in the past.
I did. I believe it is still viable to play. I'm not so sure, I'm not sold on the fact that it's viable to just do it as your commander, though, anymore. I think it's more of you need to build the deck where you can Voltron onto anything within the deck. You need multiple outlets for it, because if you just focus on one thing because you want to do commander damage, I think that now how the game's been going, you might actually just, never get the straight up kill everybody. You might kill one person and then have the rest of the table turn on you type of deal.
I think that's a fair point. I think if your entire deck is built around putting stuff on your Rafik and you lose your Rafik or he gets killed 4 times, you're just never going to win.
Yes.
You at the very least need to have backup plans, a backup plan, if not multiple backup plans. So Max, you mentioned that there are downsides here. What are the downsides you were thinking of? I mean, I guess I just mentioned one. If you lose your commander and that's your only out, so to speak, you're kind of out of options. But like, what are the other options that you think of when you think of Voltron specifically?
Yeah, I mean, that's the first one, and the biggest one is if you lose your commander, because that's typically what you are Voltroning is your commander. That kind of shuts your game plan down. I also think, depending on the type of Voltron deck you're playing, whether it's equipment or auras, you need to kind of work on finding that balance. If for some reason Tuvasa gets blown up and I have 15 auras on her, do I have a way to get all those back, or do I have a way to protect myself against whatever is going to do the destruction? And similarly with the equipment stuff, if someone casts a Vandal Blast and destroys all of your equipment, how are you going to get those back? And vice versa, your commander dies, how are you going to be able to afford those equip costs over and over again on top of recasting your commander? I think you definitely need to build in backup plans or insurance plans in case your Rafik now costs 1,800 mana and you can't cast him.
Right. How about you, Chris? Are there any downsides that jump out at you?
Oh, well, there's tons of downsides. Just the way that the game's going now with the amount of removal that people are playing. The mass removal. The mass removal for enchantments, the mass removal for artifacts. There are other types of Voltron stuff, but those I don't think are quite as powerful as what the two that we're discussing right now. So, like Mac was saying, do you have recursion? I personally think that the way that you should play a Voltron deck is not actually be it straight up Voltron. It should be more of a we'll call it like a creature maker or something like that, where you're building each separate creature but buffing them a little bit here and there. Where you're just one creature's got 3 auras on it, another creature's got 3 auras on it, another creature's got 3 auras on it. So then you're not leaving one single target to get blown out of the water.
Okay, sure, that makes sense.
But is that Voltron then? I mean, Voltron is ideally one creature gets really big and smashes.
I know that's.
I feel like that's more of like a go wide meets Voltron, like almost just like an enchantment or a typical equipment deck. Maybe you aren't caring about your commander. Maybe your commander just reduces the cost of something, so you're equipping, you're equipping a Archangel Thune with a couple auras, and you're equipping, something else. So like I get what you're saying, Chris. I don't know if that's technically Voltron though.
True.
Yeah, I think it's probably a hybrid, because the other side of that coin, Max, is I wouldn't consider your Dromoka deck to be a Voltron deck, but that's kind of a backup plan in it. Like, you're not trying to suit up Dromoka to kill somebody, but there's enough times when it just accidentally happens, when you hit somebody one time and then you draw your Blackblade Reforged.
Yep.
And you're like, oh, well, I can give Dromoka +15/+15 now, or at least make him a 15/15, or her a 15/15, and that's that second shot kills somebody. Like, it's not a Voltron deck, but it plays like one accidentally sometimes, kind of. So I do think there's some room for like discussion of kind of accidental hybrids as well. So I see what Chris is saying.
Yeah.
One of the other downsides, and I think this is the one that did pop up in that Twitter thread that I think it was Commander Sphere, but if I'm wrong, I apologize to whoever I'm misreferencing here, was sometimes you get a situation where you one-shot somebody pretty quick, you get out whatever you're getting out, whether it's auras or equipment, and by the time you kill that first person, somebody else has built up their shield so you can't poke through, or they've cast a board wipe or whatever, and now the game resets, and it's going to take you 6 turns to get back to where you were, while other people are better equipped to slow you down now, and that one person is just out of the game. So like it's the kind of deck that sometimes just pops somebody, takes them out, and then you have a tough time getting to player 2 and player 3. So I think that's a real criticism, because I have definitely seen that before. That was one of the problems when I had what's now my Kedis and Crom deck, when it was originally as an Adaways deck. That did happen playing that deck, where I could hit somebody and then I had a tough time getting players 2 or players 3.
I mean, I understand, going after player 2 and player 3 being an issue with that, but if you do knock someone out early in the game, there was a reason that you knocked them out.
Sure. Yeah.
So, I mean, there should be no issues whatsoever with them sitting around waiting for another game, because they already put the bullseye on themselves, so they should just know that was how it was going to end either way.
And that's a much less big deal, I think, at a shop where there's half a dozen pods going, and if you get bumped out, you can just go find another one, versus like playing at someone's house with just 4 people. So yeah. I think that's, it's a thing that happens, but I think as far as being a problem, I think that just depends on where you're playing at too. It's just maybe not a big deal sometimes too.
Okay.
So how about the upsides? So we talked about like what the downsides of it are. And I guess I mentioned one of the upsides is in the case of Max's Dromoka deck, Dromoka's got a pretty big body anyway, and evasion anyway, and a little bit of protection anyway. So it's pretty easy for Max to just put a Berserk in that deck and put in a Blackblade Reforged and just turn the deck into something that can 2-shot somebody pretty easily without having to work too hard towards that. I think that probably maybe applies more to the kind of hybrid decks we were talking about than a deck like a dedicated Voltron deck. But I think sometimes that does work out that way, where even if it isn't your main strategy, you can go Voltron in some particular decks pretty easily. I think that's a pretty good upside. That's
for sure. That's definitely a good upside.
Any other ones you guys can think of?
The color combination. Honestly, most decks that I see that are running this are your green-whitish decks. And green is probably the best color in Magic. Yes, I said it. Everyone's out there listening. I harass everybody
I'm done. It's been a great run, guys. Chris said it. I'm out of here.
You accomplished what you wanted to accomplish.
Yeah, it is probably the best color in Magic, so you have all that aspect to it. Then you get all the card, like the card draw from green. Then you gain the life gain from white and other stuff like that, where it just sets you so far ahead from the rest of the group. I think the color combinations are probably the biggest upside to building a Voltron deck.
Well, and there's some synergy baked in there, too, because green tends to card draw based on either damage dealt or the size of a creature.
Yep.
And you're playing an archetype where you're building your creatures up big to do a bunch of combat damage. Hunter's Insight and Hunter's Prowess are decent cards. Those are ones that do where you draw cards based on the damage a creature deals. Those are pretty good in general. In Max's Dromoka deck, what's Dromoka by default? Max of 5 power?
5/7, yep.
And very rarely is it just hitting for 5. It's usually more than that. There's been so many times those cards have just drawn max a dozen cards.
Yep.
Because that's just what he's doing, right? There's just synergy baked in there. His creature's big, he's making it bigger, and it's all kind of one thing. When you make one thing better, it helps all the other things in green and white like that. Just Selesnya really tends to work that way for sure. So let's maybe talk about a few of the Voltron styles, I guess. We've been talking mostly about aura or equipment decks, but let's maybe specifically take a look at aura decks, because your Tuvasa deck is heavily an aura deck, and Chris, when you had an Earl deck that was a heavy aura-based deck as well.
Only enchantments. I took the approach with that deck that you did with your Sigarda deck of no artifacts.
Okay.
Same here for Tuvasa.
So what are the strengths of building like that?
How about the synergy in general? I mean, it's ridiculous because you have how many enchantresses and all,
right.
A lot of the good auras now, some of them you just cast and it's like, oh, and draw a card when it comes into play. Plus then your enchantress goes off, so I draw another card. And you have auras that come out and you can exile things with them. I mean, the synergies of the cards themselves are phenomenal.
Yeah, I'll jump in there. I totally agree with Chris, and it's not even just like the enchantresses that draw you cards. We got a lot of sweet stuff out of Theros Beyond Death, and a little bit in like Modern Horizons 2, where you cast an enchantment and you make a body off of some constellation creature. So not only are you building up your Voltron commander, you're also building an army to sit back and block in case your commander doesn't have vigilance or something. Those are the type of payoffs that I really enjoy, is the incremental benefit of, okay, everyone knows I'm attacking with Tuvasa, but I also have 4 2/2 Pegasi sitting in the wings ready to swing at someone else.
Well, when I first built my Sigarda deck, which was, I think it was definitely before the third Theros set came out, because that's the one that had the constellation Eidolon Blossoms.
Yep.
So it was before that set came out. And so at the time, there was Mesa Enchantress, Verdurn Enchantress, Argothian Enchantress, and Enchantress's Presence. So there was like essentially 4 different Enchantresses that could draw you cards. And I noticed when I didn't have them out. Like, if I didn't hit an Enchantress fairly early, I guess there was Core Spirit Dancer, which drew off auras, too. If I didn't hit one of those fairly quickly, my deck just didn't kick off. Then, like a couple months after I built it, we got Eidolon Blossoms. I'm like, oh, I got one more. That made a big difference, it felt like. It felt like it was much easier to hit one of the Enchantresses, and that kind of started the thing going. Since then, though, like, we've gotten Satyr Enchanter, and we've gotten what's the other Citizen Champion, excuse me. You have Shram that also will draw you off auras. We just got Sithis, Harvest Hand, and we got support cards, Nylea's Colossus. It's going to double damage. It doesn't draw you anything, but like it's a straight up win condition in an enchantment deck, or things like the Sanctum Weaver. That's basically a Serra Sanctum on a creature for enchantments. Or you mentioned Arcana Sun's Grace. It's going to make you Pegasi when you get an enchantment in play. Like, we've just gotten so many support cards since then, a bunch of which are actually enchantments. Like, if you cast Eidolon Blossoms when you have an Enchantress out, it itself draws you a card because it's an enchantment. A couple of the Theros gods that interact, like, or Theros creatures, Nylea's Colossus is the same thing. It's an enchantment creature. Like, the amount of synergy we've gotten, Sithis is an enchantment creature. A lot of the aura stuff just really, really works well together, and we've gotten so many of those toys in the last, 4 or 5 years. And particularly Modern Horizons 2 gave us a bunch of stuff that, it just makes the synergy in those decks just crazy.
Yeah, it does. Because they even have a modern Enchantress deck out there right now, which is, it's dumb to watch it play. And it whiffs hard, though. It's just like Commander. If you don't get the key pieces out there, it whiffs hard and just sits there and goes, yeah, that was fun. No, not really.
Well, and we talked about the obvious synergy with Enchantresses and drawing cards, but like, depending on how far down that rabbit hole you want to go, in my Sigarda deck, I'm doing this, and I think Max has a little bit of it in his Tuvasa deck as well. Like, you can lean into enchantments for your ramp as well. Like, Wild Growth's a great card, but it's that much better when you're in an enchantment deck, and it's going to add to your devotion and add to the count on your Serra Sanctum, and it's going to add to your Ancestral Mask or whatever. There's a handful of those cards too. Like, you can almost exclusively ramp using enchantments if you want to, that are going to, draw you cards and add to your enchantment count and all of those things. Those kind of decks really, really feed off itself, basically.
Agreed.
That, however, can also be a pretty big downside if we're going to talk about weaknesses, because, man, that Merciless Eviction set to enchantments feels real bad in those situations.
Austere Command,
Yeah.
Back to Nature. I mean, there is a lot of them. There's even old ones that just, they read Destroy All Global or all whatever enchantments,
Right.
Stuff like that. And so there are a lot of mass removal for enchantments.
Yeah, definitely. Or things that, like, that give you protection from whatever color you're choosing. And I don't think any colorless enchantments. Like, there are times when you're playing an artifact deck when you can get around, color protection or things of that nature. Enchantments, you just can't. Like, if someone's got some way to stop damage from white or green sources or something, you better remove that, because you don't have an alternate way to poke damage through, really, because your stuff is just all has colors.
I believe there is one colorless aura, Dana, and that's the Eldrazi Conscription.
Yep, I'll say that the Eldrazi had at least one, if not two. Yeah, that's right. Good call. Which is a really good aura, actually.
Right.
Yeah, if I was playing in a meta where, or if it was just like a group of my friends and one guy, that's all he ever played was Aura Voltron deck, I would play with a Circle of Protections and just be like, see, I can play enchantments too, and just lock you out
Sure,
of the game.
Yeah.
I think the weaknesses are where you really have to focus on what colors you're playing. Chris mentioned, it kind of revolves around green-white, and, like, he ran Ural, which is green-white-red. Well, red, you get a lot of bonuses in, like, haste, but you don't get, where, like, Tuvasa's banned green-white-blue, you don't get counter magic, you don't get, stuff that could stop those Merciless Evictions and Austere Commands. So I think it just kind of depends on your strategy, and, like any color combination, the shortcomings you're walking into knowing you're picking that color combination.
Yeah, when you're playing the Ural deck, you have access to haste and things of that nature that other colors don't. When you're playing the Bant Enchantress deck like you are, Max, you have access to counter magic, so you can stop things like that Cyclonic Rift or that board wipe, that Merciless Eviction or something that I'm just going to eat in my Sigarda deck. So, like, yeah, they're spreading it out a little bit does give you some protection in ways you don't in just playing the Selesnya deck like I'm playing, for sure.
But just remember, you can always run Teferi's Protection and avoid everything.
That's very true. Teferi's Protection is a ridiculous card, and it is absolutely in my Enchantress deck. So how about equipment decks? What do you guys have for experience running those?
I don't think I've ever ran an equipment deck. I've played against quite a few of them, but I don't think I've ever ran one myself.
How about you, Max? I think you kind of had one for a while,
I had
didn't you?
one way back in the day. It was one of my original Tajik builds. Of course, it was Boros, so that was back before Boros was good, or as good as it is now, I should say. I don't know, it worked, but it was so resource hungry, and that was, again, like before Smothering Tithe and Monologue Tax, and a bunch of these equip reducers, like SRAM wasn't even out yet. So it's been a long time. I prefer the aura method over equipment, but that's just my playstyle personally, because I know if I'm going to get 2-for-1 for playing like an Ancestral Mask, I probably deserve it, because I'm probably going to give my creature 30-30, where if I get, if someone removes my creature I'm trying to equip Sword of Feast and Famine on, okay, well, I can still slap that onto something else. So it does have it has its benefits, but I do think the equipment version is more resource hungry overall.
I think that's a good point. I think it's 6 of one, half dozen of the other. I think it's either easier because you have ways to cheat it in, so you can cheat like the upside to equipment, and the downside is when the creature dies with auras on it, the auras go to the graveyard. When the creature dies with equipment on it, they stay in play. That's good. The downside is you have to then re-equip all of those, versus an aura deck where you can sometimes bring them just back into play and attach them to your creature with like a retether or replenish. There's a couple different ways to do that. That's how that balance always was, at least. There's a bunch of different ways, though, these days to equip stuff for free. Max mentioned Shram. I mentioned Arden earlier. Pure Steel Paladin does it. There's a handful of different cards that let you just equip stuff for nothing, or at least for a reduced cost, which makes that way easier. So that's definitely overcomes that downside a little bit, but the first equipment deck I built, and I'll just briefly mention this, was a Kemba Ka Regent deck. This was pretty early when I was playing EDH, so it was mono white equipment. The first game I played it, I killed everybody because I got out whatever equipment I was playing. I got them all on Kemba. I made a bunch of cats. I went wide and killed, So like it was an equipment deck. It wasn't entirely Voltron, but because the way Kemba works, when you have equipment on it, you make a cat for each equipment on Kemba. So it was not truly a Voltron deck, but it felt super strong that first game. And I'm like, man, I can't believe how good this deck is. And then like the next 5 times I played it, someone just cast a board wipe and I was done. So it felt super good that first game because I just had known happened to hit a board wipe, and after that it was just brutal because then it would cost me, instead of spending like 2 mana one turn to equip an equipment, the next mana put, spend 4 mana to put 2 more things on it. Then I'm like, well, I'm going to recast Kemba and pass the turn because I can't afford to spend 8 mana to re-equip stuff, and then someone destroys Kemba, and I'm like, oh, well, okay, I guess I'm going to have to recast Kemba again next turn and hope I can make it around the board to have a chance to re-equip stuff. It just wasn't, it was really, really rough. And again, kind of like how we mentioned, there's been a bunch of enchantresses added. A lot of the ways to free equip stuff has came in the last few years too. So that's, I think, made equipment deck a lot easier to play for sure. I did then try the bad Teysa, we'll call her, which is the 7 mana Teysa, I think. I tried her for a little while as an equipment commander, in part because I had equipment. Like I had picked up swords of whatever and whatever, punch and face and kicking butt over the years, and wanted to put them in a deck. So like I had the cards and just never could figure out what to do with them from that Kemba deck. So I tried Bad Teysa for a while, and I just recently gave that Arden and Essior deck a go, and just not only having access to a way to equip for free in Arden, but having a way to equip for free in the command zone makes that so much easier. That's such a nice thing to do. It just makes that a much more viable archetype, I think, than maybe it was even 3 or 4 years ago when you just had way less options. Now with Sigarda's Aid and with things like Arden, and you mentioned SRAM, there's just a lot more stuff you can do to get equipment onto creatures to rebuild faster, and I think that definitely makes a big difference there when it comes to equipment decks. You do have the same problem there you have with Enchantress decks where that Merciless Eviction's bad business, or that austere command, but that's I think that's going to be a problem with any kind of artifact heavy deck you build. No different with an equipment deck. You just have to hope you have that Fierce Protection in hand, because if you don't, it's going to be rough. But like that's just true for a lot of decks.
Agreed.
So those are the 2 main ones I think that people tend to build, and I obviously have one of them. But then things get a little bit more exotic, but like I've definitely seen +1 counter Voltron decks where they're trying to put a gazillion counters on a creature and swing through for lethal damage. Max, what was the
Skullbriar, the walking
Skullbriar, there we go. Yeah, you had and you had a Mardu, that Mardu vampire too that gained counters off life gain.
Yeah.
So like you've made a couple semi attempts at this as well.
Both were failed miserably. I think Skullbriar was the better of the 2 just because it was 2 colors and green was involved. That's, one of my favorite colors. The issue with Skullbriar is those counters stay on him, so a Black Sun Zenith just ruins your game for the rest of your life. But he is, it was very fast. It comes out, it starts hitting hard. Even like Crush could be a +1/+1 counter Voltron type build. I think out of all the other type of Voltron things we're going to talk about, this is probably the last one I would probably consider Voltron-y, like would probably fall into Voltron, but that's just my opinion.
Yeah, because like these I think tend to be a little more, we talked about something being a hybrid, these tend to work that way I think a little bit, because I've seen Azuri Claw Progress decks or something, for example. No one's equipping, obviously you can't put the counters on Azuri, so people are putting them on other stuff, but like I've seen some of those Azuri decks get really crazy big creatures that are swinging in at you. Sometimes they're combo decks, but like not always. I have at least one friend we play with in our shop regularly who has an Azuri deck, and he's not playing it as a combo. He's just trying to make a bunch of 30/30 creatures with +1 counters to swing in and punch you in the face. And it works pretty well, particularly that Azuri deck where, because of how it works from the command zone, to rebuild you just have to put creatures in play and cast something, and the experience counters are what makes the creature huge. So in that particular case, I think it's easy to rebuild, but I would say on average, it's much harder to rebuild with one of those decks unless you have an Ozolith out, because there's no replenish really, or there's no Arden that lets you equip for free.
No, it's definitely requires a lot more revolving pieces too to get the +1/+1 counter synergy going.
Right, yeah. Like, if you're playing that Rafik Swords deck, you just draw Rafik and draw a sword and put it down on Rafik and swing. If you're playing a +1 counters deck, for the most part, you're like, okay, I need to have a creature out and way to put counters on it and maybe doubling season and hope it has trample. Like, if you're putting a sword on something, it has protection that maybe is enough to get through for damage without having to worry about trample. With +1 counters, there's just a lot more things that you have to have go your way to even get it working in the first place, let alone get it working after a board wipe.
Yep.
I'm trying to think if we've seen any more of these. Like, I've seen a couple of them, but this tends to be much more rare than the auras or equipment decks.
I would agree too.
How about mutate ones? Like, I've heard of people building a mutate deck where they're trying to stack a bunch of different things to make a big Voltron commander swinging through with mutate, but I don't know if I've ever seen that in a deck. Have you guys run into that before?
I don't understand how mutate works to this day still.
Well, it has 2,500 words in the rules text, so...
Like, what happens? So, like, when the creature dies, do both creatures go to the graveyard? I mean, I don't understand, like, because I don't ever see anyone play it, so that's why I don't understand it.
I'm pretty sure it's like Bestow. If the top creature dies, they all fall off and become individual creatures.
Well, there's a strength right there. How is that sound?
Yes,
that sounds
there we
like
go.
A good strength right there.
Yeah, when it dies, you're not losing it. Your creatures are now creatures, so you can still swing with them next turn. It's pretty tough to rebuild, though, I think, necessarily. Like, you're not knocked down to nothing, but to rebuild those creatures as a mutate, you probably have to bounce them back to your hand and find a way to recast them, but I guess that's doable, too.
Yeah, I mean, and a lot of them that I've seen played, because there's only a few of them I've ever seen played, they seem really strong, both versions of the creature anyways, so...
Yeah, particularly that first stack, you're like, ugh, trying to deal with that, and then... Even if, like I said, even if you blow it up and there's still a bunch of stuff in play, that's a problem as well.
Yeah.
There's also the downside of you can't mutate onto a human creature type. So that eliminates a lot of creatures that you might normally include in your deck.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an easy thing to forget, but like human is the most popular, is the most common tribe. Might not be the most popular in a tribal deck sense, but like I think it's the most common creature type to encounter in Magic.
That I could see that. Yeah. Now I go back and think about a lot of them have like human as like the subtype on. It's like a human berserker or a human something or another, but yeah.
So you lose access to a lot of stuff there for sure. So we'll jump to one that I've definitely built, and that's a combat buffs deck. And talking about my partner deck with Kedis and Crom, where I'm running things like, I guess it's not Giant Growth, but the red equivalent of Giant Growth, where a creature gets +3/+3 till end of turn. But the way the deck works is there's a bunch of copy effects in that deck, so I'm going to, give Kedis +3/+3, which I will copy to make him into a 10/10, and then I'll double his power and hopefully copy that. And then, and that's going to be on Crom. And then Kedis makes that damage to everybody. So if I can hit one person with a creature that I've buffed for one turn to 30/30, it's dealing damage to everybody. It's kind of like that effect you had when Saskia hit. She hits one person, she hits multiple people. And I've seen Saskia decks built that way, where people are trying to just do that, like combat buff Saskia. I'm swinging with Saskia, I'm going to cast Hatred and something else and just buff that creature up 3 times or something to pop one person in the face, which will pop somebody else in the face. So I've seen it built that way as well. The strengths of that is it's kind of tough to plan for it. You can see that you're going to get hit and it's going to hit everybody else, but like you tend to like, okay, is something coming down or is nothing coming down? It's much tougher to defend against, I think. Downside is those are one-off effects. That sword is always there. That equipment, even if the creature dies, stays in play. The auras are going to be there all the time on your creature. If it dies, you have ways to bring them back in theory. It's much harder, for the most part, to recast multiple instant speed combat tricks from a deck onto a creature if you don't manage to make it work the first time.
Yeah, it's definitely much more mana intensive to do something like that.
That too, right. Yeah, and that's one of the things I've encountered with that Kedis and Crom deck. Like, I have access to blue, but man, my counterspell suite better not cost much mana if I'm going to save stuff mid-combat, because that's when people are going to try to stop me. They want me to cast things first, and then they're going to try to remove my commander just to do maximum damage to me. So then I have spent a bunch of mana to get those combat tricks in place, and now I have to deal with stopping that counterspell coming through. So like, luckily I'm in red, so I have access to things like Fierce Guardianship, or Force of Will, although I'm not running Force of Will. Pact of Negation, I guess I do have in that deck. So like the 0-cost counterspells in that deck are really valuable to me. Deflecting Swat is one I use to just change the target of the removal spell to something else. those are super useful because I tend to spend most of my mana on those combat tricks, which leaves me wide open to somebody who's just like, unsummon. I'm like, oh no. Like, feels real bad if I don't have a way to stop that. And my way to stop it needs to be really, really easy to cast if I've tapped out or come close to tapping out.
That unsummon sounds like something Dr. Mike has done to you.
I think he may have. He loves those like cards that are good, but there's slightly better versions that have been printed in the last 20 years, but he likes running the old ones that aren't as good, and it's that much sweeter when he hits somebody with one of them, and you're like, why are you running that, and why did I just lose to it?
That's why you lost to it, is because you don't think about it. You think
I
about all
guess,
the good
yeah,
ones,
exactly.
and you don't think about the worst case scenario ones.
I forgot what it was. As an aside, he killed somebody. It wasn't this week, it was last week. He did that in a game. He was playing with 3 decks that were more powerful than his, and he did kill everybody with some sequence of really stupid bad cards. And he was so happy. It was great to watch. So if you guys, aside from, I guess, my deck or the occasional Saskia deck, have you run into that kind of deck very much, the combat buffs one?
I think the only one that I've ever seen aside from this one, I think it was one that you built too, Dana. Wasn't it with that red goblin, Zada, I think it was?
Yeah, Zada does kind of work that way a little bit. Feather the Redeemed kind of does, I guess, a little bit as well.
Yeah. I haven't really seen any decks that are based around this. I've seen combat buffs within decks.
Sure,
like certain key cards, but never one actually built around doing that exact sequence of stuff.
Yeah, I'm with Chris here. The only two that really come to mind is playing against Joey Schultz's Feather deck, and then playing against Ryan Peneff's Zada deck, or even Lenny Woolley's 5-color Zada deck. Both of those kind of revolve around the combat trick stuff, but it's an army in a can. Primary, combat tricks secondary.
Yeah, I think I've seen people talking about what's the dinosaur that copies spells? The new one from last year's
Calamax.
Calamax. I think people talking about doing it with Calamax too, because you can copy stuff, so you can copy a giant growth and a berserk and then something else. So I believe that's a thing that people have done as well. Although I think there's just way easier ways to combo off and win with Calamax than doing that, so I'm not sure how common that is. But I've thought about building, and I guess now we can move on to whatever other weird Voltron stuff you guys have might seen. The one I want to mention that I kind of messed with to try to figure out how to work, and I never have quite got it where I wanted it, was Anax Hardened in the Forge, whose power is equal to your devotion to red. So my thought there was I was just going to try to build an mono red Anax deck with as many permanents as I can run that had like a gazillion red pips. So Cavalier Flame is triple red, or like Cyclops Gladiator is triple red. Kuldotha Phoenix or Moonveil Dragon, like as many things that had like 3 or 4 even red pips, a Chroma Angel of Fury or whatever, as many of those things in the deck as possible to try to just have my permanents and just accidentally turn Anax into like a 30/3 or something.
I've also seen, I guess this is one we didn't talk about during the +1/+1 counters, is Ashwin the Pilgrim. I've played against a couple of those Voltron decks where it's the, jokingly the 99 Mountain deck, just because
Sure.
you want to get as many counters on Ashwin as you can without doing it more than 3 times a turn, and then just get it to, whatever total you need, and boom.
You just slam somebody with a giant Ashling, and then if you need to, you have the option to pop it, just take the board out and start over again, I guess.
Exactly.
Yeah, that one's kind of interesting. Any other like oddball ones you guys can think of?
I can't really think of anything. Like I'm thinking really hard too, and
Sure.
a lot of people have pulled away from this, strategy of building.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
I've seen like Multani decks, whether they're the original
sure.
Multani or the new Multani, just because similar to Annex, it's all about how many lands you control, and it's green, so it's just run all the fetch land tutors, run some big beaters, and then you just drop your commander and swing away.
Throw a Blackblade Reforged on there, and you're in green, so you have access to a Berserk or something if you need to double that damage. And we just got that new 3-mana damage doubler from Forgotten Realms as well. It's like choose your weapon, I believe.
Yep.
So there's a few things there you could do. Yeah, no, that's actually kind of a cool idea. I like that one as well. Yeah, that's fun. Okay, so we've talked about like all the different weird options that you have with Voltron. Do you guys like or dislike playing against Voltron decks?
I like it because it's
Okay.
easy to know exactly what they're doing. Like,
Oh, sure.
you know, they have a set game plan, and you know they're not gonna like come out with some wild and crazy card you've never seen before. Type of deal. You
Sure.
just know that it's gonna be okay. Well, so I see Tuvasa come out. I'm like, okay, so if I don't see any auras coming out, then they're playing some different version of it. But the moment I see one aura, I know exactly what they're playing.
You bet.
You know, vice versa for other decks. You know, like you see the Kemba. You know, and if you don't see equipment coming out, you look at them really strangely and wonder what they're doing. But then when you see the equipment, you're like, yeah, that's kind of what I thought was going to happen.
Right.
So, I mean, you know what the game's going to be about, you know how to stop it and everything like that. So I don't mind playing against them at all.
How about you, Max?
Yeah, I'm in the same boat. I mean, especially with Rule Zero conversations, the word Voltron is typically brought up. You might not say it's an equipment Voltron or an aura Voltron,
Sure.
but you're going to say it's a Voltron deck. So right there, I'm already knowing, like, okay, it's either going to be super fast, like my Tuvasa deck, or it's going to be a little more grindy just so they can get those equipment out and figure out a way to equip them all or find their free equipment card, free equip cost cards. I like playing against them. They are a ticking clock, so you either know you got to beat them before they beat you, or somehow be the last one they kill to hopefully survive.
Yeah, I agree with all of that as well. And I'm trying to think how to phrase that because, like, I don't want anyone who plays combo decks to feel like you can't play a combo deck against me. But I kind of like to understand the game state at least. Like, when you lose to a combo that you totally don't see coming, at least me, I don't necessarily love that experience. You know, it's different if like someone's setting up their combo, but when someone just like top decks this one card and, you know, hey, I'm playing a Niv Mizzet deck, go buy this top deck Curiosity. That isn't my favorite way to lose a game necessarily, because it's really tough to do anything about. Like, if you happen to get lucky and happen to have mana left up and you can counterspell it, I guess great. But that's pretty tough to plan around that. Whereas I feel like at least with a Voltron deck, yeah, you're going to just get one shot sometimes and lose. But you know what's happening and like you feel like, well, I need to prepare for that. I think back years ago, we had a friend at the shop who had a Thraxamundar zombie deck. And if I remember right, Thrax is a 6/6, but when he attacks, the person he attacks has to sacrifice a creature.
7/7.
And he becomes a 7/7. So I like the thing with that Thrax deck, I always felt like, and Thrax has haste too. So I was always doing the math. Okay, when Thrax comes down, I need to have 2 creatures available. I need to have something to block with, and I need to have something to sacrifice. Because if I don't have 2 things in play, then I'm vulnerable to taking 7 Thrax damage to the face, and which is going to be, by the time it comes back around to me, it's probably going to be like 10 or 12, and I could easily get 2-shot. Whereas if I have 2 creatures in play, then Thrax is going to probably get poked at somebody else who doesn't have 2 creatures in play, because they'll have to lose 1 blocker, and then Thrax will get through free and hit him for 7 or whatever it winds up being. But I knew what it was, right? Like, I knew what that game was. Okay, I'm playing against a Thrax deck. I need to make sure I get my commander out on curve quickly, and I need to get something else out, and I need to get that board state in play to deal with that Thrax. Versus something like a Curiosity and Niv Mizzet, where you're like, it's just going to happen, and like it's very difficult to plan around dealing with that eventuality. Any final thoughts from you guys here before we wrap this up?
So my only final thoughts on this is, don't build this deck. I've seen a lot of people build them, all excited going into it. They spent a lot of money on it, and then they turned around and said they didn't like it because, as we were stating, you know, it's a single focused game plan, and people know how to stop it.
Sure.
You know, so if you're building it as a one of, you know, I'm going to just suit up one creature, kill you with this creature, people can stop it easily. And that's why I brought up early on about the, you know, the hybrid mix of it. You know, if you're going to do it, build it as a hybrid mix where you have multiple outlets to do multiple different things so you can actually enjoy the game overall.
How about you, Max?
I can see where Chris is coming from about, you know, building the hybrid plan. I kind of view my build as like, I'm flooring it. This is the deck I want to go push the pedal all the way to the mat and just go super quick.
Sure.
If I win, I win. If I lose, I lose. I'm going to have a good time, and hopefully I have a good time. Everybody else at the table has a good time. But I also like the combat step, so this kind of archetype fits right into my playstyle. So, like,
see, Max, you should build mono red goblins. You should build a Krenko deck. I mean, that would fit your
expensive.
playstyle.
But no, I'm all for Voltron decks. I kind of always have been, always will be. Yeah, like we've discussed a lot of the weaknesses today, but there are ways around them, or at least ways to minimize how many of them that might impact you.
The thing, I'm somebody who's built, I guess, 2 Voltron decks in the last year. I built that Kedis and Crown deck, and now I have and they're both partner decks, weirdly enough. One's equipment-based, and one is that Combat Tricks deck, and I guess I have my Sigarda deck, who kind of is a Voltron deck as well, that I've had for 7 years now, I think. So I guess I have 3 Voltron decks, technically. I clearly must like it on some level. The one thing I will note, though, I've built, I think, 5 new decks in the last 2 years, I believe, that I've kept. Decks I've built and I've kept together, and that's not counting ones I've taken apart. Of the 5, the 2 Voltron decks that I've built were the ones that I've had to tinker with the most. That my SCR and Arden deck is 3 weeks old, and I think I've replaced over 20 cards in it so far. Like 1/5 of that deck, or more than 1/5, closing in on a quarter of it at this point, has been swapped out with something else. And the same is very much true of my Kedis and Crom deck. That deck is a little over a year old now. I played with that deck. First of all, it took me a long time to figure out how to build it in the first place before I even put it together on paper. And the second thing I've done is, like, I bet I've made 30 to 40 swaps in that deck since I've got it together. Like, it's just required a ton of messing around. That's not just new cards coming out. That's just me tweaking it to get it to work the way I want it to work. And that's been very much the case with my equipment deck as well. In the less than 3 weeks, I've just changed a gazillion cards out, just trying to, like, get the balance right. So I would say, at least based on the couple of Voltron decks I've built recently, there's just a lot of knobs to fiddle with. So I would warn you, if you do decide to build your first Voltron deck, prepare yourself for that. It's going to require probably more work once you have it together than most decks do to get it where you want it to be.
That's definitely a very, very valid point there, Dana, and I like that you said that.
Okay, I think that is probably going to wrap up episode 278. Thanks to Max and Chris for another great show. We will be back later this week with another Decks You Play episode that Max and Chris will be heading up. Until then, I am Dana. You can find me on Twitter at Dana Roach. You can find Max at CMDRCentral_Max. You can find Chris at WiseSquishy1. Our show is edited by Rafael Garcia, and our podcast theme is Retro Future Dirty by Kevin MacLeod, licensed via Creative Commons. We'll be back later this week. Until then, I am Dana.
I'm Max.
And I'm Chris.